Welcome to the Ideal Investor Show. This is the podcast where we help you challenge your mindset and discover where you are. Tired of stories about other people's success? We can help you change your life, determine your time freedom point, and join us on the journey to financial success. Let's go. Hey guys, welcome back to the Ideal Investor Show. Today I want to go a little bit into some stuff that I found this week in the news and in reports. And one thing I want to say up front is the Ideal Investor Show is never really aiming to be political or anything like that. But on the other hand, we are obviously exposed to rules and laws and stuff like that, or changes in policy. And with this kind of constant hype in the media about the upcoming elections, it's a little bit unavoidable for something to sound a little bit, political. But rest assured, it's not really meant to be political. So what am I talking about? There is an initiative, and one of the things why I gave that little precursor is because you would say, okay, we are 4 months away from the election, and then the term ends in January. So even if you're kind of generous, you could say we're 6 months away from getting a new government. Why would the current government actually come up with any kind of new things that are relevant for us as residential real estate investors? But they did. I can't really explain why, but what is this that new suggestion that was just recently unveiled? And this comes from the Biden government, and it basically talks about the goal, one of the goals, assuming that Biden gets reelected or some Democrat gets reelected. And the goal is, and it always sounds very good, to provide more affordable housing to more people. And I think as real estate investors, well, we want that too, but affordable needs to be basically a balanced thing. Affordable to the tenant, but also accomplishing the fundamental idea of having a property in the first place. Right. And so what we're talking about is not affordability in the sense of people buying houses, but people being our tenants. And for me, affordability means that there needs to be a fair split as far as what is a reasonable market rate rent for the area that the house is and for the space and for the amenities and all that kind of stuff. What is possible for tenants to pay, right? Because if we have a situation where we have increased or set the rents at a level that our tenants can barely pay them based on the economic strength in the area, then we're running the risk that people cannot make the payment, and we're constantly, or our property managers are constantly chasing after the tenants to pay their rent, right? So that's definitely something that we want to avoid, and it needs to be a good balance. On the other hand, if you really look at the situation, and people got significant increases in their wages like they have in the last few years, but they also had to cope with inflation, and we basically got significant increases in property taxes, much, much more than used to be the case, because the value of the properties increased. And most states, as I've mentioned many, many times on this show, most states go around every year or 2 or 3 to look at what is the value of the properties, and then the county treasurer or the state treasurer basically says, okay, on average, all the properties have increased 20% in value in the last 2 years, so let's increase property taxes by 20%. The only state I'm aware of where that's not allowed is California, but all others, they do that. And I've seen this in my own property tax statements that I get for all our investment properties. And so that increase in cost has to be compensated. Then the other part is the increase in getting anybody. Because when we're saying our tenants got increases in wages, that also means that people that work in a plumbing business, people that work in an electrical business, people that work in a roofing business and so forth. And I'm not talking about the owners, but the employees that are sent out for doing maintenance on our properties, they got these increases too. And guess what? That means that those companies have actually increased their prices, which is what we have to pay to get anything fixed. So we have that price inflation for maintenance, and we have basically the inflation that we're getting from the property taxes. That means the affordability is a balance between what is a reasonable cash flow expectation, because if we can't have that, then we should not make any investments. That's always been the case. That's always been part of the strategy. And I've always said we should never, none of our clients should ever buy a property that isn't cash flow positive from the beginning and that remains cash flow positive throughout the time that we own it, which is basically forever. So what the Biden administration is basically suggesting and kind of promising in a sense for the next term, if they get reelected, is what they call federal rent control. And what that would mean is basically that, at least the way they have laid it right now, is that you couldn't increase the rent by more than 5% per year. In general, if we just look at that number, at that suggestion, assuming this became law, then that means if your property taxes increase 10% because the price or the value of the house has increased 10%, then you would basically cut into your positive cash flow. Now, if that were to happen once, okay, you can say, okay, I can handle that. But if that happens because prices and values for the houses keep increasing, but you're not allowed to increase the rent by more than 5%, you sooner or later get to the point where you cannot be cash flow positive anymore. Right? And if we apply our own rules, we would say if we can't be cash flow positive, then we need to sell the property. What typically happens is when somebody sells a property, and this is not mentioned, this is like any kind of announcement of a new law, they don't really go into all that much detail, so it wasn't really mentioned. If you retain the right that when you sell the property, that the new owner has the opportunity to take over the tenant, but then adjust the rent to what a property that just now came onto the market fresh would actually demand. Now, you can imagine what happens, right? If somebody has a property 5, 6, 8 years, and all you could always do is 5% increase maximum, then sooner or later, if new properties and other properties come on the market, your supposedly affordable property is basically lower in rent than everybody else, and any opportunity or any new owner would want to get would be taken to increase the rent back to market rate. Now, here's one thing, and this has also become typical, in my opinion, with almost any rule or law that has been issued, is it's never really straight out. So the two things that are known right now, and I really can only say I hope this never really becomes a law, is that supposedly this restriction of federal rent control should only apply to property owners that have more than 50 units. Now, on first glance, you might say, okay, well, then that's basically for apartment or multifamily. And that's true. But imagine somebody has a larger company. I'm thinking, for example, about an organization like REI Nation, which is basically an investment company that also offers turnkey properties. I'm pretty sure they have several hundred units. And all of those units are single-family homes, right? So they would get punished by not being allowed to increase the rent by more than 5%. But you and I and anybody who has like 10, 20, 30 units, and that could be units in fourplexes or single family homes, we don't. So our properties get more opportunity to increase rents, and only the large owners cannot increase rent. That really makes no sense to me. Right. And the same thing is supposedly this affordability thing is not supposed to apply to new build. So what will you end up having? You will basically have existing stock of houses which are restricted in rent increases, occupied by people who can only afford that level of rent that the government allows. And everybody else is living in places that are much more expensive. And so if you have owners like us who will say, okay, well, then I want at least 3 rents in security deposit or 4 rents in security deposit, then you would get people who can easily make that kind of a payment in your property. They will never leave because they know there's no other place where I can live this cheaply. This is distorting the market like any of these umbrella rules always do. And I just want you to be aware that this is a critical thing that we should all keep an eye on, because if it were to become law, and right now it's only a suggestion, but if it were to become law, it could really, really affect our whole approach, our whole strategy of only really being invested in properties that have positive cash flow. Keep that in mind. I mean, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen with the election anyway, and which of the suggested things that they say during campaigns will ever really become law. But I wanted to bring you this one, and I can only say I hope that never happens. Not because I don't want affordability for people, but I don't want it to happen where the government is telling us as owners what we can do with our properties. So that's it for today. Be well and stay safe, and I talk to you tomorrow.